Jay Turner. I hope everyone can hear me. All right. I am one of the graders at PCGS. I'm on a very talented team, and I'm here to give a lecture today on the manufacturing process for coins, mostly the modern manufacturing process for coins, and how errors and varieties are created. It's very important in numismatics and how coins are actually made. In fact, with the Mexican Mint on this piece, they even feature the dies being struck on a screw press. And it's a very fascinating study into numismatics and understanding how this stuff is produced. One of the biggest questions that people still, even experts, have is what is an error versus a variety? An error coin is something that was created outside of mint tolerances in the production of a coin. A variety is something that occurs on a die that is repeated and differs from the design enough for it to be categorized as something that's different. Now, understanding how coins are made is how you can understand how these error coins exist and what those errors are. So in the modern manufacturing process of coins, at most mints, when they still produce their own planchets, which a lot of mints have gone to outsourcing, the coins start with metal stock, which is usually produced in these big giant metal rolls that would go close to higher than the screen height here. These are then rolled out and thinned out to the diameter of the planchet that they're looking to produce. The reason why they do this is it gives a consistent weight to those coins as they're punched out to make the blanks and then the planchets. Errors that occur when with the metal stock being produced is sometimes the stock is rolled too thin, the stock is rolled too thick, or the stock is tapered. This comes sometimes with inconsistencies in weight, inconsistencies in strike. Sometimes the wrong stock thickness is used to make the production of the planchets. This is a very well-known case in sometimes the United States where in 1970 a bunch of quarters were produced using dime thickness stock and created errors that are in abundance because they rolled an entire sheet of metal to that thickness and stamped it out and produced those coins. But the most common error is improper alloy mixture. And when they improperly mix the alloy, what ends up happening is you end up with a lamination where the metal starts to peel apart because it's not mixed properly. And these laminations occur sometimes prior to the strike of the coin, but frequently after the strike of the coin, sometimes while the coin's in circulation, leaving dramatic effects such as this example here. Sometimes before the coin is struck, the planchet will actually split apart if the metal is not alloyed properly. This one was split apart prior to strike, so when the coin was actually struck, the planchet was too thin, so the design didn't get fully struck, and you could see how rough the planchet is because of the metal inconsistencies, and that's what you're observing, and that's basically as made from the mint. And in some cases, which is very a rare occurrence, you can, here's another example where this was split after the strike. And in rare occurrences, you can actually find both sides of the coin where the coin is split after the strike occurs. Now, when they stamp out the rolled out metal to produce blanks and planchets, you end up with the webbing. Where errors occur in this is in the manufacturing of the blank planchet. So first you stamp it out and it's a blank. Then they upset the edge of the coin to help produce a better strike of the coin. And this is what we call planchets. No edge with edge. This is an edging machine, so the planchets are sent through, upsetting the rim of the coin, which creates a better strike and more consistency. And if it ends up being a proof coin, the planchets are polished and special finishes are applied. With the planchet issues, you have, again, after the coin was struck, or during the strike of the coin, because of the improper alloy mixture, you have sometimes cracked planchets. One of the very common errors that occur with the manufacturing of blanks and planchets is clips. And what that is when they're punching out the coins from the strips of metal, if the punch overlaps on something that's already been cut out, such as this piece where it's an octagonal Mexican planchet, you'll actually have wherever the part that was cut out missing from the coin. Then when the coin is struck, you end up missing big sections of the coin. This is a curved clip because this is a circular coin and the punch was circular. This is a straight edge clip. And what that happens is if you have something that stamps out a planchet on the straight edge of the metal, whether it be the end or the side, when the coin is struck, it ends up being a straight edge. But in this case, the coin expanded to where the straightness is, so it has slight curvature, but it is a straight edge clip. If the webbing falls into the machinery, you'll often have what they call a bow tie clip or struck on fragment. So this piece, for instance, is struck on the fragment of the cutout for the planchets. One of the more modern errors that occur is with bimetallic coinage, where in the manufacturing of the piece, two different planchets are placed into each other prior to the coin being struck, and usually the pressure of the coin being struck adheres the center to the center portion of the coin. So one of the errors that we sometimes encounter, but they're rare, are missing center pieces, where the insert planchet was never fed into the bimetallic part, or offset inserts where the insert part wasn't properly inserted, the coin is struck, and so you actually get an off-center insert with the correct centering of the coin. Now comes the striking process of the coin. And this goes from being very simple to very complicated in modern technology. To produce a coin, you need two dies, one being a hammer die, one being an anvil die. Hammer is the one that goes down and strikes the coin. Anvil is the one that gets struck on the top. With modern manufacturing, you have a collar. The planchet goes into the collar, and the coin is struck. Now, the die, how it's made, how coins are made, this is a die, it's blank. This is going to be a reverse image. I'll go into the die manufacturing later. And this is a collar. So you can see this is going to be a collar for a coin that has a reeded edge. And so this is technically the third side of a coin. So whatever image is on the collar, whether it be lettering, plain, reading, or any kind of design element, that's going to be what ends up on there, and that's what holds the coin in place as well as giving the design. So errors that come with striking. When the dies are being set up to produce the coin, especially in the modern manufacturing, they adjust the pressure to give the most ideal strike. So quite often they feed a couple coins in, stamp them out, and they see whether or not it's struck too much pressure, too little pressure, and usually the coins are destroyed after the effect, but sometimes they get out. And so when they get out, we call it a die adjustment strike. So this is one that was struck with way too little pressure. So you see how weak the image is, the lettering is missing, the date's very, very weak. And the difference between a die adjustment strike and what is more common, which is a struck through error, in which you have something that's obstructing the die that strikes the coin, so the coin comes out weak, is you can see that the reverse of this coin is complete and fully struck. The obverse is very, very weak. So this is a struck through, usually grease or some other kind of debris, but it's not a pressure issue. Another kind of occurring error that sometimes happens, but most of the time it's done on purpose, is a uniface strike. And that means that only one die was used to produce that coin. Usually these are produced after hours at the mint. It's a lot of times snuck out and sold to collectors. But they do sometimes occur by mistake when they're loading in the machinery and they forget to put a die, but that's a very, very rare occurrence. The most common striking error is struck off center. And that basically means that the planchet wasn't fully loaded in between the two dies. And so when the dice came down to strike the coin, the only part that got struck was the part that was in between those two dies. A broad struck means that the coin was centered in between the two dies, so that all of the image is there. However, the metal was struck with too much pressure, and it struck outside the dies, usually pushing past the collar. So if you have all of the image there, but it's elongated or sometimes looking a little bit off-center, but if everything's there, it's a broad struck, not an off-center strike. Another common but much more rare occurrence is a double struck coin or multiple struck coin. And that basically means that after the coin is struck, the dice come down on the coin again and giving it a secondary strike. This sometimes can occur from many strikes. If something gets stuck in the chamber and it just keeps getting struck and struck and struck and struck, you'll end up with many multiple strike coins such as this piece. And some pieces that have actually been snuck out of mints have hundreds of coins stuck together with potentially thousands of strikes, because the dies come down and they produce thousands of coins a minute now. A chain strike error means that a coin wasn't fully ejected from the die. Another planchet gets fed in, and so the coins are struck together. It's a very rare error. But what ends up happening is where the part that was struck into the coin is blank. So you have an indent piece, and the other piece has a double struck. And it's very rare to actually find pieces that are chain strikes, because most of the time the pieces get separated or one gets caught and one gets out. But if you do find them, they fit together, and it's incredibly rare. Indent, as I said before, means a coin or something else was laying on top of the piece while it got struck and leaving that portion of the coin blank. Indent can be just the same kind of coin where it's a curvature, or it could be a full-size planchet of a different denomination, such as this piece, where a smaller denomination was on top and it got struck and leaving a full-size indent. A brockage is a different kind of indent where a struck coin, the design gets transferred onto the other coin in a mirror image fashion. Because basically a die is a mirror image. It strikes the positive image of the coin, and then that gets transferred onto another coin, but in a reversed fashion. Quite often you'll have partial brockages, not necessarily full brockages, but partial brockages, where another coin that was struck lays on top of the other coin, it gets struck into it. And so instead of it being blank, you have a partial blockage where you see a reversed image of that coin that was laying on top of it. Now the next error is struck through. Basically, struck through means something got in between the two dies when they came down and got struck into the coin. This example has a big piece of plastic struck into a 5-ounce quarter, but it can be basically anything. So here's a Lincoln cent that was struck through fabric. And you have coins that are struck through staples, coins that are struck through nails, coins that are struck through any kind of debris out there. But you also have ones that are just a little bit of grease, and it's still considered an error coin. Here's a piece that was struck through a struck fragment. So you have a partial blockage of a fragment that was struck onto the coin. Very cool piece. Now, if a planchet gets stuck onto a die, such as this one, which was a Lincoln cent planchet that got stuck because it got fed into a dime die, it becomes a die cap, which means that that coin is now capped onto the die. And so as the die continues to strike coins, that die cap is now obstructing that die. So a lot of times what you'll end up with is you'll end up with a very distorted image of what is coming through that die that's being obscured by that coin. Die caps, very rare to come out of the mint. Struck through die caps, you can sometimes find them, but they're pretty scarce. Here's one that was struck through a die cap, but the die cap was folding over, and so you actually have a fold going through the design of the capped struck through. You also have wrong planchet errors, and what a wrong planchet error basically is you have a planchet that was intended for a different coin. It gets left in the bottom of the feed bin, gets dumped into the machine, and it gets stamped out on the wrong planchet. If it's struck on a different coin, it's another kind of error. So if it's different denomination, they call it a double denomination, but this can also occur as an error or on purpose throughout the world. So quite frequently you'll find French coins struck over other French coins, not errors, but intentional. But you'll find sometimes where mistakes occur where it's not intentional, and these can bring significant premiums over a normal coin. A very rare kind of error is a fold over, in which the planchet actually gets bent as it's being struck. It didn't get fed in properly, usually on the side. Dies come down, strikes the coin, and it folds over. And so you actually have the planchet that's bent and a struck portion. Very, very, very rare error that gets out. Now, something that gets out of the mint that's not supposed to is a feeding finger. And what that is it basically feeds the planchets into the dies at a very quick speed, because now when you're doing modern production of coinage, you're striking thousands of coins a minute, sometimes millions of coins an hour. And so what ends up happening is you have to have the machinery to push the planchet in, push the planchet out, and what happens is sometimes these feeding fingers get stuck and they get struck. And when they do, the mint usually unscrews them, throws them into scrap metal, screws in a new one. And so the ones that exist out there either are ones that are snuck out by the mint employees and sold to market, usually from Chile or Malaysia, or ones that get salvaged from scrap yards when people get scrap metal from the mint and they go, well, let's see what's in here. Now, the manufacturing of dies is interesting. How it began was people would engrave a reverse image into a coin, into a die, and then basically stamp it out. Whatever they engraved, the reverse would come out when it was struck. As technology progressed into the Middle Ages and into much later, there was a system of series of punches and also engraving. So basically what they would do is the mint would make a master punch, so it would be consistent, and then they would punch the letters, they would punch the shield, they would punch the lions, whatever it would be, into the different portions of the coin to try and create uniformity. And here's a Royale coin, and you could tell that this is a punched production of a die because look at all the P's, they're all the exact same. Look at the ones, they're exactly the same. So this is something that was punched in one at a time into the die to produce that die. What happened later was they said, we're going to mass manufacture dies. So how that occurred is you have a Galvano where an artist will produce an image onto plaster. That image is going to be loaded into a reduction machine. And so this is a reduction machine right here. It is copied. It takes hours and hours and hours, sometimes days, where it goes through and it runs over and it transfers down to the size of a production die. With modern technology, they don't necessarily use plasters anymore. Some mints do it digitally, where they actually have a computer and the artist digitally makes the die, can make it as detailed as they want, and the computer produces either the die or produces a Galvano that later becomes the production for the hubs and then the dies. So here's a computer producing one of the plaster Galvano pieces. So what happens is after the piece is reduced, you have a master hub. Here is what you have: blank hubs. And when the blank hub is fed and pressed up against the master hub, you end up with a hub. And the hub is going to have the correct look and design of the coin. It's going to be how that coin is going to be struck. So all the lettering is going to be readable and not reversed. It's going to be the correct positive image of the coin. Then they take that and they press a die into that, and you have a reversed image of what's going to be that coin. And that's what's put into production to stamp out the positive image of the coin. So here you have basically a progression. You have the blank hub, the work hub, the die, and so on. One of the mistakes that occurs is varieties are created in the production of modern manufacturing of dies. And one of the more common and collectible pieces is double dies, in which the hub impression onto the die is done more than once with some kind of transferring of an image that actually ends up doubling on the coin that it produces. And there's many classifications for double dies. So one of the more common ones, which is usually more dramatic, is a rotated die doubling. And what that happens is the die is hubbed, and then the die is rotated and hubbed again. So you see everything on the coin goes in a certain direction, one way or the other, and you see the doubling goes in a certain direction. That's a rotated die doubling. And these can be very, very, very strong, and they can be very weak, depending on how much that die was rotated when it was double impressed. The next type of double die is distorted die doubling. The die comes down, not a full image is produced. Die comes down, onto the hub again, and wherever there was any kind of shifting, you'll have doubling. This is a 1971 double die odd verse set proof. And so you can actually see where the areas are doubled and what areas are not so much, based on how much was actually coined into that first die. Now, design hub doubling occurs when you have two different designs, and that die for instance, 1981 over 82, 20 centavo. What happened with this was in 1981, they decided they needed to make more 20 centavo coins for Mexico. So instead of using the next year's production dies, which were already produced, they went back and took an 82 die and hubbed over a 1981 die. And then they produced coins, and so you have a double die, which is an overdate because the design isn't correct that it was produced over. The next type is an offset hub doubling. So basically, the die comes down onto the hub, but it's offset. So you get a very weak impression or a very strong impression depending on which die or variety it is. So in 1984, it came down. It only picked up part of the ear and part of the beard. They set it correctly, hubbed it, put it into production. You have 1984 double die odd versus double ear. Hub doubling, offset. The next one's pivoted die doubling, most famously from the 95 double die penny, where it's not completely rotated, it's just pivoted just slightly. So you have doubling, but it's going to be weaker, and it's only going to be in certain areas because it wasn't a full rotation of the die. Then you have distended doubling, and this occurs basically, die comes down into the hub, it's pressed down again, not necessarily shifting, but with too much pressure. So you end up with massive lettering or other kind of images, such as the Liberty here on this Indian odd verse of a buffalo nickel. And this is called distended die doubling because it basically distended too much, was too much pressure, and it caused a non-consistent die compared to the ones that was within mint tolerances for the coin. And then what happened was after mints decided to do a single production for die production to try and avoid having double dies, you have some stuff start popping up, such as a 97 double die odd verse, where basically the die came in, was just very tilted and just got corrected. And so you have very, very minor doubling, but still collectible because modern United States Mint doesn't produce too much double dies, and this occurs in other countries too. Now, when dies are produced using the punch system, you have all sorts of punching errors. Could be repunching, this could be overpunching. So basically you have overdates, you have repunch dates, you have repunch mint marks, you have all sorts of different kinds of varieties that occur from this. So here is a repunch date. Basically it's punched in, maybe the punch didn't go through far enough, then they punch it again. And quite often this was done perfectly acceptable for mint tolerances, but as collectors look back at this stuff, study dies, they go, okay, well this is kind of cool, it's repunched, and sometimes you have an added value to it because it's now a variety.
Especially if it's a 3 over 3 like that one, it usually doesn't bring much of a premium, but if it's 3 over some other date.
Yeah, so you have, here it's an 1811 over 0. Right. So that's going to bring decent premium to a collector. Something like this may not bring a premium, but there are people who do sometimes pay slight or significant premiums depending on how severe the repunching can be. So for instance, here's a 8 real coin where the M was punched in horizontally and then punched over. Basically, anything that can be punched into the coin can be repunched, can be screwed up and corrected, and creates a variety to that coin. And quite often you'll have blundered die varieties. So here's where the S's are punched in backwards into the coin, creating a blundered die. But it's a variety and it's not within mint tolerances. Or even if it is within mint tolerances, collectors look back at it and say this is interesting or this is rare, and assert a value to those pieces. Now, another kind of variety that occurs is modified dies. So here's one that was a siege piece where they added a tiny dot to the piece and dot onto the wing. And because it has a very interesting story to this, these command a huge premium because it's a variety different to normal piece, because this was done by a siege. But if it was something that was just punched in a different kind of coin that had no association, it wouldn't necessarily be of any kind of significance. Now, next kind of variety that occurs is broken die varieties. Now, this can kind of fall between variety and error. Usually these are kind of collected as errors. And so basically, as a die is produced in coins, they start to fail. They're striking tons and tons of coins. Sometimes they're not properly heated, not properly treated, and sometimes it's just worn out. And so when they start to break, you start to see effects like die cracks on the coin. And if a die crack goes all the way across the coin, such as this one, it's considered a retained cut, because eventually this will break off and it will just become a die break, such as this, where the die cracked all the way down, the piece of the die fell out, and going forward, that area where the coin broke out is going to be filled in as they stamp out the coins.
And also notice that the area on the reverse directly underneath the cut.
Yeah, it's going to be very weak because you don't have the pressure from that die coming down to fill in that area.
That's usually the classic sign that it's genuine.
Yes.
Some errors are.
And
are
I'll get to that. So, another kind of variety / error is die clashing. That occurs when basically the two dies that are producing the coin come together with nothing in between and transfer the image of the opposite side onto the other side. And then going forward, as the coins are produced, you have that kind of effect producing onto the coins from the reversed image of the coin. Another kind of variety / error is mulling, where you have two dies that were never intended to be put together, either through mistake or on purpose, are put together, put into production, and create a coin such as this piece where it has a gold obverse and a 5-centavo reverse. And they become very popular with collectors, but they're both errors and varieties. Another one is called rotated dies. So basically, this is one of the more famous ones, where dies are supposed to be either aligned 180 degrees opposite or lined up to be, 360 degrees difference. And so if they're aligned incorrectly, it produces an error or variety in which the coin has a rotated reverse or a rotated dies. Now, non-errors, but I sometimes get them at PCGS, or when I worked at a different grading service, I would get them quite frequently, are die scratches, die polishing, monodie defects, other die issues that are all within mint tolerances. So for it to be something that a collector or for the mint to even consider it something that's different, it has to be outside of their reign of tolerance. And all of this is considered within tolerance. So here's die scratching. This is also a non-error, which is strike doubling. And strike doubling is different than die doubling. Basically, as the coin is being struck, the die rattles a little bit, creating a flat, shallow effect on some areas of the coin. There's no collector value to this, there's no demand for this, and they're not varieties and they're not errors. It's considered mint tolerance.
You see a lot of these being submitted as for variety, tons of them.
Tons. And basically something like a 69S, hundreds a year. So worn dies are not errors or varieties. They basically is considered acceptable. And as a die strikes coins, it gets hot. It's basically melting the surface of the die. And so that sometimes gets into an effect where you'll see slight bubbling, slight bowing on the coins being produced, because as the die is heating up, it's starting to fail, it's starting to crack, It's not an error, it's not a variety, it's just part of the die production and part of the die life. Now, we also have other kinds of errors. And so, for instance, we have issues where certain mints basically allow their employees or look a blind eye to the production of purpose errors. This occurred in Chile, occurred in Malaysia, it occurred in other parts of the world. And basically, Mint employees go in there and they say, we're going to make something that feasibly can't be done by mistake. And they put it out and they sell it to collectors. So, for instance, you'll have a smaller die striking a larger planchet. Can't be done because it won't fit into a collar. This can only be done by being done on purpose. It's not an error. It's something that was done by Mint employees on purpose.
So these are more like fantasy pieces?
They call them midnight production pieces. There is collector demand for them. The grading services will encapsulate them and call them what they are. They are genuinely produced in the Mint. However, they're not errors. They're done on purpose. So, for instance, here's a Chilean piece struck with 2 adverse dies. Done on purpose. They produced hundreds of these pieces to sell. They were never put in circulation. You know, you would go up to a Mint worker and say, hey, do you have anything interesting? And they'd pull out a couple pieces, and they would sell them and produce more. Now, another quote-unquote error is Mint canceling. It's not an error. It's actually when coins don't meet the standard for the Mint. A lot of mints, instead of sending them off to being scrapped, decided we're having too many issues where the scrap yards are pulling those coins out and selling them to collectors. We're going to start canceling them by defacing those coins. They're not errors, they're canceled coins, but there is a collector demand for this stuff. Especially when you have something like this where an off-center coin went through the canceling machine. However, the part that was off-center was too thin to be canceled. So the part that got canceled was the blank part, and the struck part didn't get canceled. Now, we get a ton of counterfeit errors at all the grading services, and you see them in dealer stocks and all sorts of stuff. So I'll start going through some of these which are most frequent. And a lot of them are damaged coins. You get something that's damaged and they think it's some kind of production error. It's not. So here's one that's been flattened out with a hammer or some other kind of tool, and one side's not. Yet this got submitted as a mint error and hoping that deceive collector. Here's one that got stuck into a dryer at a laundromat, and as it went around, it tumbled the piece and all the edges got folded into each other as time progressed, and it's damage, it's not an error. Here's a piece that was struck off center, and someone took a pair of shears and just clipped off part of it and trying to call it like a error, but it got submitted. One of the things we're starting to see a lot of is people producing their own uniface coins and trying to say this is a pattern, this is a error, and basically what they're doing is they're just grinding off one side of the coin and hoping to deceive somebody with, and it's not an error, it's damage.
The weight will give that one, right?
Sometimes, yeah, but a lot of times people don't weigh it. They think it's a pattern, they just buy it and send it off to the grading service. Or
But if you got it, the first thing you would do.
I can see the grinding marks on these pieces and I don't even need to weigh them. So here's one that I got when I was in Paris, where they actually took out the lettering on the coin. So here's a Bulgaria piece, and someone actually ground out the lettering and left the wreath and submitted as an error. Can't occur, it's not a struck through, and if you actually look at the coin, you can see it's very finely bowed out where they use some kind of Dremel or something to take out that. One of the most common fake errors that we see is they take 2 coins and a hammer. They put the 2 coins on top of each other, smack it with a hammer. It transfers the design of the other coin onto the piece, and then they try and pass it off as an error. You go on eBay and you'll see dozens of these. We get them at grading services. I see them in dealer stocks. It's again, damage made to deceive people. And you can even see where the hammer went down, where the coin was laying on top on the reverse image of the coin. So another piece that we sometimes see, and they're very common, is magician pieces. And what that is that someone takes a coin and they cut out one side of it and they remove the interior part of the coin. Then they take another coin and they take the part that's missing and they cut that out and they put them together. And you can look and you can see there's a very faint seam all the way around it. But they create a 2-headed quarter and they sell them in magician shops for like $25, $15, and we get them at grading services. Now, we're starting to see a lot of fake, totally fake coins being produced as errors. So here's one that came out of Malaysia. The whole coin is bad. They used a transfer die, counterfeit obverse, and then they made a brockage die, and they stamped out the coin. So this is actually die struck. There's no error going on. The whole thing is completely fake.
What gives that one away? The poor quality of the striking?
Yeah, and if you find, you'll see more than one of these. Like, you know, I've probably seen about 15 of these now, and they'll have repeating marks with each other. But you'll notice immediately that the brockage side is not an error. It's the die. And the other thing, it is in Q's. And another thing is when you have something that's a true brockage, it's going to be a brockage of the design of the other side of the coin. So on this one, you see die cracks. There's no die cracks on the other side. So if you had a real brockage, if there's die cracks, it's going to transfer the other side of the coin. Here's one that's out of India. And one of the things that was interesting about India is they collect brockages as lucky coins. And they bring a big premium over there because they found a brockage in circulation. It was lucky. They just hit the lottery. So now we're starting to see a lot of fake dies and a lot of fake brockages. So this is a counterfeit die, but they tried to do better where they actually brought the die lump that was on the front to the back. But both sides are fake and both sides are die struck, and there was no error or fake error that occurred. It's actually both sides being false dies. Here's one out of China where once they make a counterfeit die and everyone kind of realizes, hey, this is just a completely bogus coin, they'll start sometimes making bogus mint errors, and then sometimes it does deceive people. So here's one that it's a fake die and it's double struck. Other things that we quite frequently see is glue, where it's on the surface of the coin and it gets glued to another coin. You see something kind of like a mirror effect and they go, oh, I found an error, but it comes right off. People plate coins with gold or silver or platinum, and they think it's some kind of annealing error or some kind of error coin. They send it in and it's just plated. Sometimes you'll get coins that are whizzed where they melt the surface of the coin using a Dremel tool or something like that, and people think it's some kind of error variety. It's just damaging the coin. We'll get engraving that's sent in as errors. We'll get a colorized coin. So for instance, you'll have colorized coins from Cuba or Palau or some other country, and they'll take those coins, they'll take the coloring off, and they'll try and send them as an error or as a pattern, but it's just removed the coloring from the coin. And lots of other kind of fake errors. One of the things that's really fascinating about error collecting now is on large-scale mints, say United States, China, Australia, where they do massive productions of coins, as the coins are leaving the dies, they actually have computer programs looking at every single coin as it leaves the die. Some kind of struck through happens, some kind of off center happens, something happens, those coins get rejected. This is a computer that's actually scanning one of the dies, and it's microscopically scanning a die before it gets put into production, make sure there's no kind of die defect, no kind of doubling on the die, and if there is anything that gets detected by the computer, that die gets rejected from use, and trying to avoid having varieties and trying to avoid having errors get into the market. So that's basically a study on how errors and varieties occur and a basic understanding of the minting process. Are there any questions? Yes?
You showed a lamination one that had big lamination error.
Yes.
I've noticed that when it's an older coin, like not probably steam operated, but earlier, but still coin pressed,
Yes.
it's interpreted instead of an error like a flaw.
Yes.
Is it related to the steam operating process?
Well, it's still an error. Basically, one of the big issues is that when something gets submitted to usually a grading service, the graders have to make a determination, is this something that we're just going to straight grade, or is this something that's considered not market acceptable, where it's detrimental to the look of the coin? And if it's considered detrimental to the marketing of that coin, it's going to usually come back as planchet flaw. Now, if it's submitted as a mint error, then we will describe it as a mint error and straight grade that coin. The exception being, if it's a lamination which is starting to peel up and there's a potential for that grading service to damage that coin by putting it into a gasket or sealing it into the machine, we will opt not to do it, and we'll just call it peeling lamination and return the coin, because we don't want to damage the coin because you have a peeling on the coin. And the last thing we want to do is you get the coin back and you go, what the heck? I sent in a gem coin, now there's a big chunk of it missing. And it does happen.
And the actual gluing process is like vibration, so if it has any kind of small lamination, it'll pop right off.
Yeah.
You generally get that more on the base metal alloys, which weren't used that much. I'm talking about like the nickel, copper nickel, and the aluminum, bronze, and brass, and the more modern alloys that weren't used 200 years ago in the screw press days. They weren't striking nickel coins.
No, and when you use some of this stuff, and some mints actually use recycled material, and they don't necessarily burn off all the dirt and debris on those pieces because they're doing mass production. They don't care. The coin's worth 10 cents or 25 cents for face value. You'll have issues on those pieces later on or in the production, but a lot of times it was within mint tolerance, but now we look at it today and we go, wow, that's a big mistake. And today it would be a big mistake because our mint tolerance has gone from being this much tolerance to this much tolerance. So something that was considered acceptable in 1978 would never be allowed out of the mint in 2012. So, and that's one of the things that's interesting is as time progresses with mint errors and as mints crack down and get better production into play, errors basically disappear. So, any other kind of questions or?
Laminations can also be helped. If you take a coin and heat it up, if there's any bubbles inside that coin, it'll split open.
Yeah, and if we actually see somebody, where they've peeled it off or they tried to tool off more of it, and we do get that, we actually reject the coin for being that. And so, that's the case at PCGS, and we do get that sometimes where, it's a very minor lamination, and I could see where they've tried to extend the lamination to make it more of a error to try and get more of a premium, and then we will call it what it is, damage or tooled or altered. So, any other questions? All right, thank you very much.